thank you. So as Andreas mentioned, I had a question up there, which is really the title of what I'm going to be talking about today. Who cares about APIs? Obviously a stupid question at an API conference because I assume that all of you do. But I'm kind of afraid that maybe too few people actually care about APIs. So a little bit about me. Originally, I'm a software engineer, started out as a developer. Eventually, reality hits and someone tells you to make other people develop stuff, right? So that's kind of what happened to me. But I've kind of kept hold of the developer part of me. Some things I've had fun developing was integrations against some of the social media and CRM APIs, some of the big public APIs that everybody's talking about. Slightly painful sometimes, I would say. Otherwise, at Kapow, where I work, we do something called browser-based automation, basically automating stuff that you can do in a browser. So that's obviously been something that I've worked on for years. A little bit of a disclaimer. The company that I work for actually makes a living wrapping web applications that don't have an API in APIs. We call them synthetic APIs. So basically the way it works is you have a web application and you build something that we call a robot. On top of that, you can think of it as kind of a script on top of this. And then the functionality that comes out of using the web app, you can expose that in an API like REST, Java, .NET, something like that. And the way it works is basically we have an IDE that has a visual development environment that has kind of a workflow at the top where you define the process you're going through. And in the big center here, we have a view that's typically a browser. In some cases, if you're actually working with APIs, you have XML or JSON, Excel or other things in there. But so some of you might have worked with things like UI-based testing on things like Selenium. That's basically the same type of thing. So what we do is we expose an API to things that didn't used to have an API. And that kind of gives some interesting perspectives as to what happens when things do suddenly have an API. So why am I doing this talk? And why did I call it Who Cares About APIs? So Andreas had a little bit in his talk, but I have some random numbers up there too. Programmable Web recently had a blog saying, woo, 10,000 APIs. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's great, but there are like 8.8 billion websites out there. So what is that? When you have a clear division of responsibility between the back end and the front end, you can have different teams doing that. You can have people work more independently when you design, as we heard earlier, from the outside in. So I think it's great, but not a lot of people have that yet. And one of the reasons is that there are some upfront costs to that. It's probably not the cheapest way to do if you're just trying to start with one front end. It's also really, really hard to generalize based on a single example. I've seen so much Java code where people thought, object-oriented programming is fine, let me do some abstractions, that will save me a lot of time later, that's going to be great. But when example number 2 comes along, it probably doesn't really fit the generalization that you did. It's very hard to generalize on a single example. I think it's a good exercise to do. I think there are sound architectural principles behind the API-first strategy, but there's a cost, and it's not that easy. In some way, I think you can see not creating an API for your application as a form of technical debt. So what you're doing is you're not taking the upfront cost, but it might come later. I think in many, many cases we're seeing today, one front end is not going to be enough. And we see partners wanting to use the APIs. We see a lot of interesting use cases that are not being met because people took the short route, they took the cheap route, they did not create an API. And a lot of times when you have a good question, the answer is follow the money. And it's really, I think, also in the API case, a little bit a case of following the money. And one of the key points I want to make here is that it's not always the entity, the developer, the person, the company who builds the application that has something to gain from making an API. So we're lost. We're begging, we're asking for APIs. And I've taken an example from one of our customers, Pitt, Ohio, that's a very large trucking company in the United States. And they get orders from their customers on an email. Please take this shipment from A to B as fast as possible, right? So what do? They pick up the email, they go into their internal scheduling application, find out when they can get some truck to come pick it up, take it from A to B, and then they go to their partners. And the partner portals, they need to enter these orders into. For instance, they might work with other trucking companies to actually get the truck there. They might have premium customers where they are required as a service to their customers to go in and update and say, yes, your truck, it will be there later today, 5 o'clock, we confirm it, it's all good. Who has an incentive to create APIs for these things? Once upon a time, they bought this internal scheduling application. Apparently nobody thought about the APIs. So now they're stuck with that. The vendor might not even exist anymore, or at least it really wasn't something they were looking for at the time where they purchased the application. How about the partner portal? Well, maybe if you're Walmart, you can choose to say, you have to put stuff in my way, because I'm big enough to demand that. But for most of the companies out there, there is some kind of imbalance that makes it impossible for them to go out and demand an API. These partners, these customers, might not really care that Pitt, Ohio has a lot of manual labor involved in updating all these applications and keeping them in sync. It's not really their problem. It's Pitt, Ohio's expense. So who has an incentive to build these APIs? Well, certainly not the people who actually have the power to do that. Now, of course, the reason I make a living is we have Kapow in the mix, and we basically have what we call robots actually going out building those synthetic APIs, picking up the emails, handling the scheduling application, and updating the partner portal. So, what does that mean? That means you can automate things because you're not depending on other people to have APIs or make them available to you. Let me give you one more example, because that was an internal thing. That was a cost thing. Now, I actually just put this slide in there when I was talking to someone over lunch, and we were discussing examples. And I remembered that we actually have another customer that chose a different thing about following the money. The company Click a Taxi. So they provide a really nice service. You have a mobile app, you can click a button and get a taxi sent to wherever you are very quickly. And Click a Taxi actually happens to be one of our customers. They were trying to roll out this system to 50 countries in 80 months. And that means that they have to integrate to so many booking systems of all the local taxi companies that might not have APIs. And when you're small, you can't go out and demand an API from those. They won't care until you reach a certain volume that you're bringing enough revenue to those companies for them to actually care to build you an API. So, you sat through a Kapow commercial. Sorry about that. Okay, so why did I do that? Well, I think it illustrates some of the advantages that we can gain from being in a programmable world. I recently sat through a user conference we had. One of our customers had a good point on one of our slides. She said, let's put humans to work on the things that need human minds, and let's automate the rest. And this paves the way for a lot of savings that you can have based on automating manual processes. It can also, as we saw in the Click a Taxi example, not just automate the things you're doing internally, it can allow you to scale your whole business in a much different way than if you have to do things manually. It's not possible without automation. Another point that I think we've not talked a lot about today is how people's valuable data gets stuck in some vendor's proprietary system. I think it's really troublesome that people have their customer data, all kinds of valuable data that they run their business on, sometimes stuck in applications that don't have APIs. And they don't discover that until it's too late and they want to move their data out of there, right? Vendors have an incentive to make APIs that allow you to put data into their application perhaps, but they don't have that much of an incentive to make APIs that allow you to get your data out there once it's stuck. So I think those are important things that people acquiring IT services or software should really care about, because at some point it's really going to bite. Another thing that APIs enable you is really to take data from a host of different systems and put those into consolidated views. They know if you have everything stuck in a silo and you don't have APIs or something similar to those silos, you're going to continue to have a siloed view of everything that's going around in the business. I don't understand personally why the presence of APIs is not currently on the checklist that IT has when you're purchasing something new. Everyone checks for security, scalability, etc. when they purchase something, but why are they not caring about these points? So, APIs are great, but sometimes you have to be a little skeptic, and I do get a little old and grumpy in some cases when it comes to APIs. They're not very standardized. There's a real learning curve to using APIs. Sometimes you're lucky, it has good documentation, code examples, SDKs, everything. In some cases, you're not. And for the auth protocol, I love that, but if you've ever tried to implement against 7 different providers, you'll know it's all a little bit different. The tokens have slightly different names, and you can't just reuse your code. It's not as standardized as we'd like it to be. It can get a lot smoother. I see in some of the presentations that we have providers that are trying to put layers on top of that to get us out of those problems. But right now, it's still not always fun to be programming against it just because there is an API. Public APIs can get closed down or restricted. We've seen that with, for instance, Twitter, that changed their terms of service because they found that some of the clients being made were really competing against themselves. They might even be cooler, more enjoyable to use than the real Twitter applications, and they changed their terms of service, so that got shut down. LinkedIn APIs don't provide the same data that you get out of using the front end, etc., etc. I see companies not really being fully committed, but putting public APIs out there and then kind of regretting a little bit what they're doing. And I think a lot of it still has to do with following the money and not having found appropriate business models where companies actually know what they want to do with those APIs out there. It's not easy. So I didn't want to be the one talking all the time, so I left some time in here for some questions. Some of the things I'd like to discuss with you guys, because I have more questions than I have answers for you, is have you experienced this discrepancy between the people who need an API and the ones that actually have it? Anyone? These are random questions. You can come up with your own, right? I still don't understand why we're not more aggressively demanding APIs from software vendors. Why are we so aggressively going about on cloud and other buzzwords? Why is API not really a buzzword yet?